of the battleship. But what is this going to do to the sailors who are on board the ship?
When was that decision made to actually put sailors on the ship?
That I can't answer. I don't know when the decision was made, if it was made per se, because they wanted a test of a ship with all personnel on board, essentially, because what use is it to have the ship invisible with nobody on board if you're going to go to sea?
So they only had one successful test, and then they were ready to jump right into a larger test with lots of people.
That is correct. That was the decision.
That was a fast-track project.
It was a fast-track project, and of course the pressure of the war was on everybody, including Tesla. And of course, after 1939, he was free to devote much more time to the project because he was out of RCA. He still was not a staff member, but he spent a lot more time on the project. Now, in January 1941, the Navy moved Duncan and I out to sea on the USS Pennsylvania, and we floated around that sea for quite a period of time, and eventually the Pennsylvania came into Pearl Harbor for overhaul, and that was in October 1941. We took leave of San Francisco, and on December 5th, our orders were cut for return to Pearl Harbor on the 5th, because that's where the Pennsylvania was, and we were still attached to it. We had not been detached yet. And on the 5th of December, we're about to board a plane in San Francisco at Alameda Naval Air Station to fly back. And captain says, your orders are canceled, as we were boarding the plane. We were taken to one of the upstairs room of the Naval Air Station, met Hal Bourne Sr., the man who was in charge of the tests, theoretically, and he was actually director of the whole Office of Naval Engineering. But he came down there and he interfered and said, we're not going to Pearl Harbor, so we were told this, and he told us this. He says, we don't want you going back to Pearl Harbor. We have reason to believe the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor within 48 to 72 hours. You're too valuable to us. We don't want you there. Stay here in San Francisco. In January, you'll be returned to the project at the Institute of Advanced Study. So that came to pass. We went back there and found the preparations for the test of the battleship well underway, all kinds of equipment on the deck, some still on the dockside.
But how did you get from San Francisco to Philadelphia?
Well, that was by normal means. If I remember right, we went by train.
Okay, so you had orders.
Yes, we had orders in San Francisco. We were on orders for the ship that we had been attached to, namely the Pennsylvania, to remain with it until January of 1943. And we were told to honor those orders by being attached to it in the sense that the home base or operating base for the Pennsylvania was San Francisco, so we were at the home base.
So was that the first time when you made this trip that you had ever known about this Philadelphia experiment or Project Rainbow?
I'm not sure I follow you.
Okay, when you went from San Francisco to Philadelphia?
No, we had already been part of the project.
You had already been there, okay.
Oh, yeah, we had already been part of the project, but we were being returned to it. And they were supposedly near completion of the preparations for the test of the battleship.
Well, on your initial phase, when you were initially part of it, in what role, what capacity did you serve?
First, the period from the beginning of 1940 through the summer, we spent 3 months in orientation with John von Neumann. Literally brought us up to speed on what they were doing, all the theory they were working with there, which was not taught us in the textbooks or where it was at Harvard, nor to Duncan at the University of Edinburgh. It was far ahead of what was in the books, far ahead of what was considered the normal physics theory, because they were dealing with things like multiple realities, time fields, and all of the related math, including quantum physics, as well as, unknown, of course, to us prior to that, the fact that Einstein had completed his unified field theory. It was highly classified, but was available to us there working on that project. Plus some other weird stuff thrown in by Dr. Levinson out of MIT on his time equations, and the time matrix, and all the related stuff. So we were brought up to speed in about 3 months to understand the math, but it took actually more than that for us to really comprehend what it was we were involved in. We had no idea when we joined the Institute. We were given orders literally to go there. After we finished our training at the, so to speak, the 90-day Wonder School, we had no idea what was involved, what we were going to be doing at the Institute of Advanced Study till after we were there, and they told us. They didn't tell us in advance. I'm quite certain Father knew because of his, as we found, or I found out much later, after all of this period was over, that Father was involved with intelligence out of the Pentagon and probably helped set this up. That's my assumption. I can't prove it, but I think it's reasonable, because why should two junior grade officers who had PhDs suddenly be assigned to an Institute of Advanced Study when that's not a normal place to find naval officers? But there we were. And for that matter, of course, after that, when the Navy took over the project, that became another story. There were personnel running back and forth from the headquarters of the operation in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which was set up. But up to that point of the successful test in September 1940, we made what contributions we could, mostly learn what was going on, and occasionally help with moving equipment, testing equipment, setting things up, but most primarily observe what was going on, understand the theoretical background, and make monthly reports. The Navy wanted detailed monthly reports on the theory and everything and what was happening, how it was being implemented. And, of course, as of the bottom line, they wanted to know what their money was being spent for and how it was being spent.
So that was your job?
That was our job.
You and Duncan to write the reports?
Right. But we were being groomed for something else in the future, which we didn't know about at that point. Eventually, with a successful system aboard a ship, somebody has to run it. And they didn't want a bunch of sailors running it, and they didn't want an ordinary officer running it who didn't understand the theory. Because not only were you entrusted with this equipment and the ship, if it became a fully successful operation, you also had to know, because of the theory that was involved, that you ran the equipment rather carefully and followed certain guidelines. Otherwise, you could find yourself dropping out of time altogether. Because what we were doing was creating an artificial time zone, if you would, and it is not that we were pushing ourselves out of the normal time flow. We're doing what you might call a phase shift number, wherein we were rotating partially out of the normal time field in that local area encompassing the ship, the fields around the ship doing this. And the object was that when you rotated far enough phase-wise, all the electromagnetic energy from outside, namely light or radar, would literally wrap itself around the ship and you never pick anything up. Wraps around the ship, you don't see it. That was the object. But you had to know exactly where to control the equipment at what point, and you had to know something about the characteristics of the ship, which says you ought to be trained to the job. Nobody could just come in and push a couple of buttons and turn a couple of knobs and expect everything to run right.
How did you get your training then?
That came on after September of 1940, when we were trained through the project. We started the training when the Navy pulled us out, and it was understood we would be coming back, which we did, of course, in January of 42. And at that point, we became involved with Tesla quite heavily because he was proceeding towards the test date, which had been set for March. But he also was very upset and concerned about the fact that the amount of power required to make a battleship invisible was going to be quite sufficient, he thought, to, at close range, literally fry the brains of the sailors and possibly kill them. It was a very valid consideration because the amount of power they're using is up in the megawatt region, and nobody had any prior history of this, but if anybody could anticipate what might happen, Tesla was perhaps the best man around to anticipate the possible problems. Neumann didn't particularly agree, but he was not running the project. He was sort of second in the command. He later became first in command. And Tesla was concerned about this, voiced his thoughts and his fears to Duncan and myself, as well as to von Neumann. And went to the Navy and says, I need more time than the March date. I have to find a way to shield the personnel against possible side effects. The Navy wouldn't budge on the date. It says, do what you have to do, but you've got a test date, and you'll have to meet it. Quote, there's a war on, unquote. Of course there was at that point.
Well, let's get back about your training, the specific training. Seems like it would have taken a long time for you to have gone through some classes, some school.